Alrighty. So, welcome all to what is the first episode of hopefully a long-standing series that I think I'm going to call Stone Science. My name is Jaden Johnstone. I started this channel to try and bring some lifting and nutrition wisdom to the world of YouTube sports and bodybuilding and lifting and nutrition and all that good stuff. And so, I'm going to spend today just as like a preliminary, first step in this direction, breaking down a study that I think could be kind of useful, especially to a lot of athletes, younger athletes that maybe aren't quite sure, what they should be eating carbohydrate wise. So I've spent a lot of time, especially when I was in high school, experimenting with tons of different carb sources, so like rice, pasta, fruit. I had a period where I was only eating fruit. I had a period where I was on carnivore, and so no carbs at all. And so I've been through a lot of different kind of stages. I'm 18 now, I'm in freshman year of college, and I found a study that I think kind of synthesizes a lot of my own experiences with trying different carbohydrate types, and it makes a lot of sense. I think it could help a lot of people out. So without further ado, let's get into this study. So basically what we have here is a study by Rossett, Raubman et al. So all these people over here, basically a study on fructose and glucose and post-exercise repletion of muscle energy, right? So essentially, in short, they had basically all these athletes, these different groups of athletes, eat either, fructose or glucose in mixed meals, so containing fat and protein as well as carbohydrates in those forms. And then they saw how did their muscle glycogen get filled back up by those carb sources, right? So intramolecular, intramyocellular lipid levels as well. So IMCL, so that was also like basically the fat storage, an alternative energy source to muscle glycogen, right? So using lipids instead of glucose as an energy source. So had those levels also replenish as a result of fructose and glucose. And so they wanted to kind of study that, like, so glucose levels in the muscles and also intramyocellular lipid levels, and how did those change depending on glucose or fructose intake, right, in these athletes. And so essentially, these are all healthy non-smokers, weight stable, no medication, blah, blah, blah. These were double-blind, crossover controlled, randomized clinical trials, so pretty reliable, right? Studied on 2 occasions, separated by 2 to 4 weeks. They started with a run-in period aimed at lowering the muscle energy stores, so I'm assuming this means they had them on a lower carb diet, right? Followed by prolonged exercise session, right? So they made them burn a lot of calories, burn through their muscle glycogen levels. So they had these 8 liquid meals. They monitored them over fasts and 6 hours post-prandial. So that just means post-meal on day 4. Preliminary visit wise, so this was before they did the change up fructose and glucose intake. They performed tests to exhaustion on an electrically braked leg cycle ergometer, so basically a bike, stationary bike, I'm assuming, right? And so they wanted to get a control for how much energy they could output, right, using their glycogen stores. This was the lead up period, right? So basically having them diet and burn some energy, so get their glycogen stores kind of depleted before the study started, or I guess before they got into the experimental part of the study, right? They measured intramyocellular lipid level as well as glycogen concentrations, and this is where we kind of get into the more interesting stuff here, right? So, okay. So for fructose groups and the glucose groups, right, so FRU and GUL, those are our 2 experimental groups. They contain the same total energy and macronutrient composition, right? So what does this mean? This means that both studies ate the same amount of calories, which is important, right? Because that's going to dictate, how much energy you have largely. And they also ate the same amount of macronutrients, right? So protein, carbs, and fats. All of those in gram amounts, I'm assuming, were the same, right? They wouldn't have like one group consuming more carbs, because then you have 2 different variables. You have one group that is consuming fructose and more carbs, or vice versa. That could shift the study. So they wanted to make sure that was all standard. Okay, so 3,500 calories plus or minus 154,000 or 154 calories. Kcals were about what they fed them, which is a lot. I mean, that makes sense. That's about maintenance probably for pretty athletic guys. 5.6 grams of carbohydrates per kg. So if you weigh 80 kg, which is like, let's just say 100 kg, 220 pounds, you'd be eating a lot of carbs, man. That's like 560 grams of carbohydrates. 2.5 grams of fat per kg. So if you're 100 kg or 220 pounds, you'd be eating 250 grams of fat. and 1.9 grams of protein per kg. So if you're 100 kg, 190 grams of protein, a bit less than 1 pound or 1 gram per pound of body weight, which is a pretty good amount of protein based on current scientific literature. I'm sure we've all read the studies, right? You don't need to eat 5 grams of protein per pound of body weight, 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, whatever, right? That's overdoing it. So you can get away with less. Again, 8 liquid meals a day, and these are the hours that they ate these meals at. Oh man, and interestingly, I mean, fat was from pretty varied sources, right? So they have some full cream animal sources in here. That's good stuff. Some soy and soy milk. I mean, I'm not a huge fan, but to each their own, right? And then protein from soy milk and whey protein. So very absorbable types of protein, at least in terms of whey. And then if you have like isolized soy, that can also be pretty bioavailable. Nothing too crazy, but the whey is really great, right? And then here's the important stuff, right? So fructose was added as either 5 grams of glucose per kg in glucose or 4.4 grams of fructose per kg with 0.6 grams of glucose per kg in the fructose group. So fructose group wasn't entirely fructose, it was fructose and glucose. I think that's fine. You're not going to be ingesting pure fructose in any sort of natural form ever, right? So, fruit, even honey, is like 50-50. Fruits can vary depending on if they're more fructose than glucose or vice versa. So that totally makes sense. And then it says it here as well, right? Using small amounts of glucose in the fructose meals prevents intestinal fructose malabsorption. The body is not used to just eating pure fructose. That's not a natural state for food. So that totally makes sense. Okay. Metabolic follow-up. This is just saying how they actually, went about performing the studies. We can kind of skip all that. Let's just get to the actual results, right? This is an important part. So, experimental part of the study was completed between 2013 and 2014. This was quite a while ago, right? But I think they actually cut somebody because they weren't adhering to the diet. But in the remaining 8 subjects, they did continue and they followed up, and we get all this great data, right? So first thing that's really interesting here is that fasting glucose, fructose, insulin, glucagon, lactate, and triglyceride concentrations were not different between fructose and glucose. What does that mean? Why does that matter? Okay, first thing, this is probably the most important, right? So fasting glucose and insulin were not different. What does that mean? When you eat a meal that has carbohydrates or a lot of protein, fats not so much, but mostly carbohydrates and protein, your insulin is going to spike. Why is this important? If you are bodybuilding or you're an athlete, a spike in insulin, one, redirects glucose out of your blood into tissue, so it's very anabolic because it promotes tissue growth, so you want that for building muscle, for recovering tissue, right? So that's important. And then, fasting glucose-wise, no one wants to have low blood sugar, right? You're just going to feel like crap. And so the fact that those were consistent across both groups is really interesting. That's something we should definitely keep in mind, right? Fasting FFA, so yeah, free fatty acids didn't change between fructose and glucose. That makes sense. That has to do, I guess, with the lipid uptake. We wouldn't expect fructose and glucose to change that too much. So let's get back to the actual results here, right? So this previous point actually on there being no difference in concentrations between fructose and glucose, this was fasted. This was not post-meal, right? So this was before they ingested their fructose and glucose meals. Yeah, right? So this was while they were fasted, I guess, in the fructose and glucose group. And then post-meal, after they just had a meal, you saw glucose and insulin, lower glucose and insulin responses in the fructose and the glucose group. So fructose did spike insulin less. This is also interesting. Postprandial, so post-meal energy expenditure, was higher in fructose than glucose, right? And it's marginally higher, but, give or take 20 calories per 6 hours, right? So the people that ate the fructose diets burnt more calories. That's really interesting, right? So if you're coming into this from a fat loss perspective, hey, eat more fruit than you do starches, maybe, then eat more fruit than like rice, potatoes, right? That's gonna be more higher percentage fructose, and apparently it's gonna make you burn more calories. So look at that. That's really interesting, right? Let's keep scrolling down here. So this is also a really great section, right? So recovery of muscle energy stores, so basically muscle glycogen, and I think IMCL, so myocellular lipid levels, 24 hours apart. So this was before and after meals. Yeah, so both fructose and glucose groups were effective in raising myocellular lipid concentrations. There was no difference between treatments in fructose and glucose. And then muscle glycogen contents were also similarly raised in fructose and glucose. So basically, muscle glycogen didn't change too much. That's what they're telling us here. Really interesting, right? You'd expect the fructose group, you'd think that the fructose group having less glycogen, it's fructose, or having less glucose would maybe not be as effective as restoring muscle glycogen, but this tells us essentially that the fructose and glucose gets broken down through these pathways in the body, they end up producing glycogen the same way, and it fills up the muscle cell. So don't have to worry too much about that. Okay, so energy metabolism during subsequent exercise. This is really insightful. Essentially, day 5, the subjects who fasted overnight reported for an endurance exercise trial, right? So these subjects have not had any carbs since the previous day's fructose and glucose carb ups, essentially, right? They measure pre-exercise all these metrics, right? So glucagon, glucose, body weight, triglyceride, free fatty acid, insulin, all this stuff. And they're similar in fructose and glucose groups, so that kind of eliminates any other possible variables besides the type of carbohydrate they had eaten the day before. And then we get this line of information, right? So basically, in contrast to the glucose group, in which all subjects were able to cycle for 3 hours, 4 out of 8, so half of the subjects in the fructose group, were unable to maintain the target power output after the diet provided, suggesting impaired endurance exercise capacity. So these athletes that had been fed a fructose group, they were unable to perform as well as the glucose group. That's pretty crazy, right? Because we already read that they had similar glycogen concentration in the muscle, that the myocellular lipid levels were also similar, right? Which is, that's just an alternative form of muscle energy. But despite that, they couldn't perform as well, right? So let's go back here. Let's keep reading. So plasma glucose concentrations increased transiently, so they increased at the beginning of the exercise, but then declined progressively under both conditions to reach significantly lower values in fructose than glucose. So the fructose level group was unable to maintain their high plasma glucose level, so blood glucose essentially, that you generally see during exercise, right? So when you exercise, when you exert yourself as an athlete, your blood glucose spikes. But in the fructose group, it spiked and then it went down, versus being more sustained versus spiking and staying up there in the glucose group, right? So that's really interesting. Basically, plasma lactate, free fatty acid concentrations were similarly raised, right? So that didn't really change too much across both groups. Lower plasma glucose concentration, again, in fructose was associated with higher glucagon, and similarly low insulin concentrations, suggesting that endogenous glucose output was impaired in fructose, right? So glucose being outputted endogenously from within, from cells. So there was lower blood glucose levels because the muscle cells, released less glucose in the fructose group. I believe that's what that's saying. So that's really interesting as well, right? This fructose group, their blood sugar didn't rise as much, and they also had a lower insulin response because insulin is secreted by the pancreas in response to a blood sugar increase in plasma, right, in the blood. When your blood glucose goes up, you release insulin, and then it redirects that glucose to where it needs to be. And so, if you're releasing less glucose, you're going to get less insulin. So very interesting there. Okay, let's take a look at this video here. All right, so fructose and post-exercise muscle energy repletion. Zoom in a little bit. Essentially what we see here, we have glucose in the dark squares and fructose in the circles. And we see that the subject cycling over this 3-hour period, right? So from 9 to 10 to 11 to 12, the subject cycling. So we see this dropout of subjects in the fructose group, right? So they could not sustain the cycling levels. They quit, right? They didn't have enough energy. Compared to the glucose level, we see all 8 subjects continue all throughout all 3 hours of the study. And then, in terms of glucose levels, I guess this is plasma glucose, we see that fructose starts up pretty similarly with the glucose group, and then decreases. It moves below glucose, so lower blood glucose in the fructose group. Free fatty acids largely the same. Lactate a bit higher in the fructose group towards the end. Insulin a bit lower consistently in the fructose group, and then glucagon a bit higher in the fructose group there. So again, very interesting stuff, right? They kind of go into at this point basically a breakdown of their hypothesis. So they hypothesized that the fructose would favor myocellular lipid repletion and alter muscle glycogen synthesis. Contrary to their hypothesis, fructose and glucose containing meals induce comparable myocellular lipid level repletion, right? This occurred despite 1.5-fold higher plasma triglyceride concentrations in fructose and glucose. So basically, even though that there was more plasma triglycerides, more fatty acid lipids in the fructose group in the blood, the myocellular lipid repletion was the same. So that wasn't absorbed more in the fructose group, right? So fatty acid uptake was not dependent on triglyceride-rich lipoprotein concentrations. Something else must be driving that. So really interesting. And they say maybe that's because insulin induced vasodilation, higher vasodilation in glucose. So basically, like we said, insulin is anabolic. Insulin serves to shuttle energy molecules to cells. And they're basically saying that potentially this was caused by the higher insulin, higher anabolic response in the glucose group, right? So despite having more triglycerides in the fructose group, because there was less insulin, those lipid triglycerides were not shuttled to the cells as effectively, and that did not lead to higher myocellular lipid repletion, right? Both fructose and glucose resulted in similar muscle glycogen repletion. Interesting, right? Muscle glycogen restored pretty similarly across both groups. A lot of gym bros will say, like, you got to eat your starches, got to eat your glucose, less fruit, because you got to restore those glycogen levels. But this is saying maybe that's not true, right? They said it's unexpected because plasma glucose and insulin, which are prime determinants of muscle glycogen, again, glucose goes straight to muscles, insulin directs that anabolic uptake of glucose and other nutrients, right? Remarkably higher in glucose and fructose. So we would expect glucose to absorb more glycogen into the muscles, right? But that wasn't the case. They were similar, right? Fructose also increased postprandial, so post-meal fructose concentrations, which makes sense, right? But to values an order of magnitude lower than plasma glucose concentrations. So this is saying that plasma fructose, so blood fructose levels, were not a major precursor of muscle glycogen. So instead they postulate that there was a conversion basically of fructose to derived circulating glucose and lactate. So the fructose that was ingested was somehow converted to glucose and lactate that could then be absorbed into the muscles in the fructose group, right? So there is some sort of intermediary pathway that can convert fructose into glucose, which can then be taken up by the muscles. Interesting stuff. Okay. Compared with glucose consumption, fructose consumption increased postprandial, so post-meal, energy expenditure and net carbohydrate oxidation. So the fructose group burned more calories and oxidated more carbs, essentially burned more carbs in the Krebs cycle, I believe, thus leading to lower total whole body carbohydrate storage in the fructose group than the glucose level, right? They're saying, though, that maybe an underestimation could be made of that. So maybe they weren't quite 18 grams lower because of fructose malabsorption. Yeah, so this is the really interesting part, right? So basically saying that glucose and fructose altered metabolic homeostasis differently during the subsequent standardized exercise session, right? So we know that the glucose group performed better. They had less dropouts. They had no dropouts, right, compared to the fructose group. And so plasma glucose concentrations decreased more sharply and were significantly lower in the second session of exercise, whereas glucagon increased earlier in fructose and glucose. Bombshell here, right? Basically, because you had one half of the fructose subjects quitting the study, right, that suggests that exercise performance may not be adequately maintained by a very high fructose diet. Maybe the higher plasma glucagon and lactate concentrations in the fructose groups might reflect counter-regulatory responses to low endogenous glucose production. So those higher glucagon and lactate concentrations were because that fructose group had lower cellular glucose release and production, right? So because of that, they're saying that maybe their worst performance was related to lower glycemia, right? So lower blood glucose, which would, therefore lead to, like they say, lower energy supply to skeletal muscle and the brain, and impaired muscle performance and increased central fatigue. Okay. Some caveats of the study. One, they studied trained athletes, right? So these are people that are probably very used to high amounts of glucose intake and turnover. Because of that, they have very high insulin sensitivity, right? Their bodies are very sensitive to insulin. They're very metabolically healthy and active. And they're saying that could affect muscle energy storage. They could probably burn more glucose than most people. They also bring up the fact that they did not measure hepatic glycogen. What is hepatic glycogen? It is liver glycogen, right? And so that's interesting because one thing that fructose does is when it's taken in by the body, part of it gets digested or sent to the liver for digestion, and then that increases liver glucose stores, which generally leads to more prolonged glucose release, right? So they didn't touch on that. That would be a separate study. Then they also say that they designed liquid meals from commercially available foods and nutrients, and that could have affected their results. And the fructose diet also contained much larger ratios of fructose to glucose than typically consumed, right? So they said, I think, like, what, something like 90% of the fructose diet was totally fructose. I think it was like 4 grams were fructose and like 0.06 were glucose. Either way, you're not going to get a ratio like that anywhere in nature, right? Even honey or fruit is like usually 50-50. So that's, kind of unnatural, right? So that is certainly a limiting factor in the study. They wanted to assess, again, whether fructose specifically affected metabolic pathways, right? And so that was kind of the whole point. Muscle glycogen synthesis was likely fueled in fructose by glucose and lactate derived from fructose and released into the blood by splanchnic organs. Splanchnic organs. I don't even know what that means. Spleen, I guess? What does splanchnic organs mean, guys? Relating to the viscera or internal organs, especially those of the abdomen. Interesting, okay. Never even read that word before. Met whole body glycogen storage was lower, and performance during subsequent exercise was decreased in the fructose group. Alright, so let's do a little summary here, right? Because there was a lot of really good stuff there. So basically, what's really interesting about this study, what you should take away, if anything, fructose is not necessarily going to decrease your muscle glycogen levels, right? So the good old glycogen stores, right? We love those. They make the muscle big, happy, and strong. However, despite fructose having less glucose than fructose, right? If you consume fructose, you're not consuming glucose. It's 2 separate molecules. They observed that fructose still replenished the glucose stores pretty adequately, right? On par with the glucose group. And so what does that mean? It means that there must be some sort of pathway in the body that was able to convert this fructose into glucose. And they deduced that it had something to do with lactate and glycagon. Essentially, eating just fructose will still restore your muscle glycogen stores. However, the group that ate fructose compared to the glucose group as their primary carbohydrate source was unable to perform for as prolonged a period with elevated blood glucose as the glucose group. And because of that, they had a 50% dropout rate in the 3 hours of biking, right? In this endurance exercise perform study. So the fructose group was unable to sustain exercise performance for 3 hours. Half of them dropped out, 4 out of the 8. Versus the glucose group, all 8 of them were able to maintain that exercise performance, right? And they also had markedly lower insulin and endogenous blood glucose. So muscle glucose was the same, but the blood glucose and the insulin response during exercise was lower in the fructose group. So if you're an athlete or a bodybuilder and you are eating a high fructose diet, your muscles can probably look pretty full. Like, they will get the glycogen they need and they will restore their muscle glycogen levels. You might even feel good in the short term, and especially like an hour or 2 hours into a workout, you might feel fine. If you're an endurance athlete or you are doing a high amount of heavy compounds, right, of lifting that requires a lot of muscle glycogen output and an elevated insulin response in the blood, then you might not perform as well. You might be bottlenecked by the fructose in your diet. So keep that in mind. That might mean, instead of eating like 10 apples a day, which I've done before, I used to try and get all my carbs from fruit, all 300 grams, right? It was not fun. Ate 10 bananas once for, I think I had a rugby the next day, and I was eating dinner with the team, and I wanted to carb up, and so I had 10 bananas, and I've never been so bloated in my life. The gas was horrible. But besides the gastrointestinal issues, I probably had some energy expenditure issues, right? Because I likely, in a game like rugby or any other sort of endurance-based, explosive, athletic, performance-based sport, right? If you are pushing yourself for hours, you're going to run into a wall where your body is going to elicit an insulin response due to elevated blood glucose. And so if you're in that fructose study, if you're eating a lot of fructose, you probably want to switch to more glucose-heavy carbohydrate sources, right? Long-winded way of saying that. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that little breakdown. I brought out my anatomy écorché here. Kind of looks like a bodybuilding statue, huh? I need one of those one day. But for now, this will be our little accompaniment on these videos. I think it seems pretty scientific, kind of smartsy, all that good stuff. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys soon for another scientific breakdown video like this. If you liked it, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. leave a comment, right? Nothing too mean. If you didn't like it, please be nice. But no, but I hope you did take something away from this video, especially if you're an athlete and you want to improve your performance. Hey, this could help you out, right? Eat more glucose, maybe lower your fructose a bit, or at least be mindful that you can maybe perform better eating more starches, glucose heavy carbohydrate sources like rice, potatoes, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, that's Jaden out, and I'll see you guys for the next video, which I think will be a lifting video. Or maybe that'll come out before this video. I guess we'll see. Either way, catch you guys next time. Peace.